The morning sun cast long shadows across the military academy grounds as General Marcus Thorne stepped out of his black sedan. His polished boots clicked against the concrete with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years in service to his country. At 62, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had never questioned an order and never expected his own to be questioned. Today was different, though he didn't know it yet. The academy buzzed with nervous energy. Hundreds of young cadets lined up in perfect formation, their uniforms pressed and shoes gleaming. This was the annual inspection, a tradition that had been going on for over a century. Every cadet knew the drill: stand straight, salute when the general passed, and answer any questions with crisp, respectful responses. General Thorne had been looking forward to this day. After recent criticism about military discipline standards, he wanted to see for himself that the next generation of officers was being properly trained. He walked with purpose, his aide Captain Rodriguez struggling to keep pace beside him. "Sir, the Academy Commandant mentioned they have an exceptional class this year," Rodriguez said, adjusting his clipboard. "Top marks across the board in academics and physical training." The general nodded, but said nothing. He had heard such claims before. What mattered to him was character, discipline, and respect for authority. These young people would someday lead soldiers in a battle. They needed to understand the chain of command wasn't just a concept. It was what kept people alive. As they approached the first formation, the cadets snapped to attention. Their movements were synchronized, their faces focused straight ahead. General Thorne felt a familiar satisfaction. This was how it should be. He began his walk down the line, occasionally stopping to ask a cadet about their studies or their plans after graduation. Each response was exactly what he expected: clear, confident, and respectful. Several cadets mentioned wanting to serve in combat units. Others spoke of intelligence work or military engineering. All saluted crisply when he moved on. Halfway through the third formation, something caught his attention. At the end of the line stood a young woman, probably 19 or 20, with dark hair pulled back in regulation style. She stood at attention like the others, but something in her posture seemed different. Not disrespectful, exactly, but there was a tension there that the generals trained I picked up immediately. As he approached her, he noticed her name tag, Cadet Sarah Martinez. Her uniform was perfect, her bearing military correct, but her eyes held something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't fear. He was used to seeing that in young cadets. It was something deeper, more complex. "Cadet Martinez," he said, stopping directly in front of her. "What's your specialty?" "Military history and strategic studies, sir," she replied. Her voice was steady, but he noticed she hadn't saluted yet. The oversight seemed deliberate rather than accidental. "And what do you plan to do with that knowledge?" he asked, studying her face more carefully. There was something familiar about her features, though he couldn't place what. "I want to serve my country, sir, but I also want to make sure we learn from our mistakes. History teaches us that blind obedience without moral courage can lead to terrible consequences." The general's eyebrows rose slightly. This wasn't the standard response he usually heard. Around them, he could sense the other cadets shifting nervously, though they maintained their positions. "Moral courage is important," he agreed slowly. "But so is respect for authority and following orders. Speaking of which, cadet, I notice you haven't saluted." This was the moment that would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Sarah Martinez looked directly into his eyes, something most cadets avoided doing, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly in the morning air. "I'm sorry, sir. I cannot salute you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the other cadets seemed to stop breathing. Captain Rodriguez dropped his pen. Even the birds seemed to quiet their morning songs. General Thorne had faced enemy fire, had made decisions that affected thousands of lives, had stood before congressional committees, and defended his actions. But in this moment, facing this young cadet's quiet refusal, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: complete surprise. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I cannot salute you, sir," Sarah repeated. "Not in good conscience." The general's face began to redden. In 40 years of military service, no one had ever refused to salute him. The very idea was inconceivable. Saluting was basic military protocol, a sign of respect that even the newest recruit understood. "Cadet Martinez, you will salute me now, or you will find yourself facing disciplinary action that will end your career before it begins," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in uniform. Sarah's hands remained at her sides. She continued to look directly at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made him pause. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was pain, deep, personal pain that seemed to go back years. "Sir, I understand the consequences of my actions," she said. "But there are some things more important than following orders. There are some things that require us to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." The general felt his temper rising. This was exactly the kind of insubordination that was destroying military discipline. These young people thought they could pick and choose which orders to follow, which traditions to respect. It was chaos. "Cadet, you have exactly 10 seconds to salute me and apologize for this display, or you're out of this academy," he said, his voice now loud enough to carry across the courtyard. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength from somewhere deep inside. When she opened them again, tears had formed, but her voice remained steady. "I'm sorry, sir. I cannot do that. You see, my father served under your command." The general's anger faltered slightly. Many of these cadets were children of military families. It wasn't unusual for him to encounter sons and daughters of soldiers he had served with over the years. "Then, he taught you better than this," the general said. "He taught you to respect the uniform and what it represents." "He did teach me about respect, sir," Sarah said, and now the tears began to fall, though she made no move to wipe them away. "He taught me about honor and duty and protecting those who cannot protect themselves." "Then, what is this about?" the general demanded, his patience wearing thin. Sarah took a shaky breath, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. "My father was Sergeant David Martinez, sir. He served in your battalion in Afghanistan in 2018. He died following your orders." The general felt as if he'd been struck. Afghanistan, 2018. He remembered that deployment, remembered the difficult decisions, the impossible choices. But the name Martinez didn't immediately register. There had been casualties, as there always were in war. Each one weighed on him, but after so many years and so many operations, individual names sometimes blur together. "Cadet, I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his voice softening slightly. War is difficult. Good soldiers make the ultimate sacrifice. But that doesn't give you the right to— "He didn't die in combat, sir," Sarah interrupted, her voice now shaking with emotion. "He died because you ordered him to stay silent." The general's world seemed to tilt. "What are you talking about?" Sarah's hands were trembling now, but she pressed on. "He came to you with evidence of war crimes, sir. Civilians being killed unnecessarily. Prisoners being abused. He had photos, witness statements. He believed in the system, believed that if he reported it through proper channels, something would be done." The general's mouth went dry. He remembered now, vaguely, a sergeant approaching him with concerns about operations in a particular sector. There had been allegations, rumors, but nothing concrete. Or had there been? The memory was fuzzy, complicated by years and other crises. "But you told him to keep quiet, didn't you?" Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger even as tears continued to fall. "You told him that rocking the boat would hurt morale, that it would give ammunition to the enemy. You told him that sometimes good soldiers have to look the other way for the greater good." "Cadet, you don't understand the complexities of—" "He tried to live with it," Sarah said, cutting him off again. "He tried to follow your orders, to keep quiet, to be a good soldier. But it ate at him. Every day, every night. He started having nightmares. He couldn't look at himself in the mirror." The general felt something cold spreading through his chest. He wanted to deny what she was saying, to dismiss it as the emotional rambling of a grieving daughter. But something in her eyes, something in the specific details she was providing, was triggering memories he had tried to bury. 6 months after you told him to stay quiet, Sarah continued, my father put his service weapon to his head and pulled the trigger. He left a note saying he was sorry he hadn't been brave enough to do the right thing, that he had failed the innocent people he was supposed to protect. The courtyard had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The general stared at this young woman, this cadet who had just destroyed his morning routine and possibly his understanding of himself. So no, sir, Sarah said, her voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow audible to everyone present. I cannot salute you. I cannot salute the man who broke my father's spirit and drove him to take his own life. I cannot salute the man who taught him that institutional loyalty was more important than moral courage. General Thorne opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely speechless. The weight of command, the burden of decisions made in impossible circumstances, the price of leadership, it all seemed to crash down on him at once. He looked at Sarah Martinez, really looked at her, and now he could see her father's features in her face. Sergeant David Martinez. The memory was coming back now, clearer and more painful than he wanted it to be. A good soldier, a reliable NCO, who had approached him with troubling allegations about activities in a forward operating base. The general remembered now how he had handled it. There had been an investigation pending, careers at stake, mission effectiveness to consider. He had made a calculation, a decision that keeping things quiet until they could be properly investigated was the best course of action. He had asked for discretion, for patience, for trust in the system. He had never followed up. Other crises had emerged. Other priorities had taken precedence. He had forgotten about Sergeant Martinez and his concerns, had assumed that no news was good news. Cadet, he said finally, his voice hoarse. I remember your father. He was a good soldier. He was a good man, Sarah replied, emphasizing the distinction. And good men shouldn't have to choose between their conscience and their orders. The general looked around the courtyard, suddenly aware that hundreds of eyes were watching this exchange. Young faces, future officers, all witnessing a moment that would likely define their understanding of leadership and moral courage. He thought about his own career, about the decisions he had made, about the times he had chosen institutional stability over individual concerns. He had always told himself it was for the greater good, that difficult choices were what separated leaders from followers. But looking at Sarah Martinez, seeing the pain in her eyes, and understanding its source, he began to wonder if he had been wrong. Not just about this incident, but about so many things over the years. Cadet Martinez, he said slowly, I think we need to talk. Privately. Sarah nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, but still maintaining her military bearing. Yes, sir. But I want you to know, I'm not looking for an apology or an explanation. I'm here because I believe the military can be better than it was for my father. I'm here to make sure that future soldiers don't face the choice he faced. As they walked toward the academy building, leaving behind a courtyard full of stunned cadets and officers, General Thorne realized that his carefully planned inspection had become something entirely different. It had become a reckoning. The young woman beside him carried herself with a dignity that reminded him why he had entered military service in the first place, to serve something greater than himself, to protect those who needed protection, to stand for principles that mattered more than personal advancement or institutional convenience. For the first time in years, General Marcus Thorne began to question whether he had been serving those principles or whether he had simply been serving the system that employed him. The conversation that was about to unfold would change both of their lives forever. The Academy conference room felt smaller than usual as General Thorne closed the door behind them. Through the large windows, he could see cadets still standing in formation, though their perfect lines had become somewhat disheveled as word of the confrontation spread through whispered conversations and sideways glances. Sarah Martinez stood at attention near the conference table, her back straight despite the emotional storm that had just played out in the courtyard. The general noticed her hands were still trembling slightly, but her jaw was set with determination that reminded him painfully of her father. "Sit down, cadet," he said quietly, gesturing to one of the chairs. For a moment, she hesitated, as if accepting his invitation might compromise the stand she had just taken. Finally, she took a seat, though she remained rigid, ready to spring back to attention at any moment. General Thorne moved to the window, looking out at the academy grounds where he had walked with such confidence just minutes before. The morning that had started as a routine inspection had become something he wasn't prepared for, a confrontation with his own past, with decisions he had buried under years of subsequent orders and responsibilities. "Tell me about your father," he said without turning around. "Not the soldier, the man. What was he like?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of love and loss that comes from losing someone too soon. "He was the kind of man who couldn't walk past a stray dog without feeding it," she began. "When I was little, our house was always full of broken things he was trying to fix. Old radios, wounded birds, neighborhood kids who needed help with homework. He believed that if you had the ability to help, you had the responsibility to do it." General Thorne closed his eyes, feeling each word like a physical blow. He could picture this man now, could remember the earnest face of Sergeant Martinez as he had approached with his concerns about activities at the forward operating base. "He joined the military because he thought it was a way to help on a bigger scale," Sarah continued. "He used to tell me that soldiers weren't just warriors, they were protectors. That our job wasn't just to fight wars, but to make sure wars were fought the right way, with honor and respect for human life." "That's a noble view," the general said, finally turning to face her. "But war is complicated. Sometimes good people get caught in impossible situations," Sarah finished for him. "I know that, sir. My father knew that too. He didn't expect war to be clean or simple. He just expected his commanders to support him when he tried to do the right thing." The general sat down across from her, suddenly feeling every one of his 62 years. "Tell me exactly what happened. What did your father tell you?" Sarah took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into dark water. "He called me from Afghanistan in September of 2018. He was different, quieter. He said there were things happening that weren't right, but he couldn't talk about details over the phone. He said he was going to report some concerns through proper channels." "Did he tell you what those concerns were?" "Not specifically, not then. But later, after he died, I found his journals, his letters. He had been documenting everything." Sarah's voice became clinical, as if distance might make the facts less painful. "There was a unit operating in a village about 20 kilometers from your base. They were supposed to be conducting hearts and minds operations, building relationships with local leaders." General Thorne felt his stomach tighten. He remembered that unit, remembered the reports of their success in pacifying a troubled area. Instead, they were using intimidation tactics, arresting village elders on fabricated charges, threatening families, taking supplies without payment. According to my father's notes, they had beaten several civilians during questionings, including an elderly man who died from his injuries. The general's hands clenched involuntarily. "These are serious allegations. If they were true, they were true," Sarah said firmly. "My father had photographs, witness statements. He had convinced several other soldiers to come forward with him. He spent weeks building a case, making sure everything was documented properly. He believed in the system, sir. He believed that if he presented the evidence correctly, through the right channels, something would be done. So he brought it to me." "Yes, sir. On October 12th, 2018. He requested a private meeting with you. You granted it." The general strained to remember that specific day. October 2018 had been a difficult month, with several operations running simultaneously and pressure from higher command to show results in a sector. Individual meetings with NCOs weren't unusual, but this one should have stood out if the allegations were as serious as Sarah described. "What happened in that meeting?" Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through it until she found what she was looking for. "I have his journal entry from that night. Would you like me to read it? The general nodded, though part of him wanted to refuse. He had a feeling that whatever was in that journal would change things irrevocably. Met with General Thorne today, Sarah read, her voice steady despite the tears forming in her eyes. Presented him with everything we had gathered about the situation in Al-Rashid village. Photos, witness statements, corroborating evidence from 4 other soldiers. I expected him to be shocked, angry, ready to take immediate action. Sarah paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand before continuing. Instead, he seemed tired, frustrated, not with the situation I was reporting, but with me for reporting it. He said he appreciated my thoroughness, but that timing was everything in military operations. He said there were bigger picture considerations I didn't understand. The general felt a chill of recognition. He could almost hear his own voice saying those words, could remember the mindset that had driven them. He told me that the unit in question was scheduled to rotate out in 6 weeks, and that creating a scandal now would undermine morale across the entire theater. He said that sometimes good soldiers have to trust their commanders to handle sensitive situations appropriately. He asked me to give him time to address the issues quietly through back channels. Sarah's voice began to shake again. I asked him what I should tell the other soldiers who had come forward with me. He said I should tell them that their concerns have been heard and were being addressed, but that discussing the matter further could compromise an ongoing investigation. He said that real leadership sometimes meant making difficult decisions for the greater good. Did I take the evidence from him? Sarah looked up from her phone, and the pain in her eyes was like looking into an open wound. You took copies and told him you would investigate personally. You told him you appreciated his moral courage and his attention to detail. You told him he was exactly the kind of NCO the Army needed. The general buried his face in his hands. He could remember now, could recall thinking that this sergeant was a good soldier who was simply naive about the complexities of command. He remembered taking the evidence and fully intending to address it appropriately. But then what had happened? Why hadn't he followed through? My father waited, Sarah continued, her voice now barely above a whisper. He waited for weeks. He kept asking the other soldiers to be patient, that the general was handling things, that the system would work. Meanwhile, reports kept coming in from Al-Rashid village. More arrests, more intimidation, more families afraid to leave their homes. Why didn't he come back to me? He tried, sir. According to his notes, he requested 3 more meetings with you in November. Each request was denied. He was told you were busy with operational matters and that he should trust that his concerns were being addressed. General Thorne felt sick. He remembered those weeks now, remembered the pressure he had been under to show results in his sector. There had been a big operation in the works, congressional oversight increasing, career implications for several officers under his command. The situation with the rogue unit had seemed like something that could wait until after more pressing matters were resolved. What happened next? He started having trouble sleeping. His letters home became different, darker, more questioning. He wrote about feeling like he had failed the people of Al-Rashid village, like he had betrayed the other soldiers who had trusted him to speak for them. He started wondering if the military was really what he thought it was. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the cadets who were finally being dismissed from formation. By December, he had stopped writing in his journal regularly. When he did write, it was mostly questions. Questions about duty and conscience, about following orders and doing what's right. Questions about what kind of man stands by while innocent people suffer. Cadet, you have to understand, in war, there are always competing priorities. Sometimes I don't want excuses, sir, Sarah said, turning back to face him. Her voice was firm but not disrespectful. I want you to understand what your decision cost. Not just my father, but everyone involved. She returned to her seat and continued. The unit in Al-Rashid village continued their operations through December and January. According to reports I found later, 2 more civilians died in custody during that period. Several families fled the village entirely. The Hearts and Minds operation became a textbook example of how not to conduct civil affairs. General Thorne felt each word like a weight added to his chest. What about the soldiers who came forward with your father? 3 of them requested transfers to other units. One filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General after my father's death, but by then, the unit had rotated home and the evidence was considered stale. The 4th soldier, Corporal James Peterson, developed severe PTSD and was medically discharged. And your father? Sarah's composure finally cracked completely. The tears she had been fighting came freely now, but she continued speaking through them. My father spent his last weeks writing letters he never sent. Letters to you, asking why his evidence had been ignored. Letters to the families in Al-Rashid village, apologizing for failing to protect them. Letters to the other soldiers, saying he was sorry for letting them down. She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket. This is from his final journal entry, dated 3 days before he died. I thought being a good soldier meant following orders. But maybe being a good soldier means having the courage to disobey bad orders. Maybe being a good soldier means accepting that sometimes you have to choose between your career and your conscience. I wasn't brave enough to make that choice when it mattered. Now it's too late. The general stared at the paper in her hands, knowing that it contained the last thoughts of a man he had failed completely. A good soldier, a good man, who had come to him seeking justice and had instead found bureaucracy and cowardice. He shot himself on February 15th, 2019, Sarah said quietly. In his quarters during evening chow when he knew his roommate would be gone. He left detailed instructions about his personal effects and a letter asking that his death not be blamed on combat stress, because that would be dishonest. He wanted everyone to know that he died because he couldn't live with the compromise he had made. The room fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet crying and the distant noise of academy life continuing outside their window. General Thorne sat motionless, staring at his hands and trying to process the enormity of what he was hearing. I joined this academy because of him, Sarah said finally. Not in spite of what happened to him, but because of it. I want to be the kind of officer who doesn't make soldiers choose between their conscience and their career. I want to be the kind of leader who has the courage to do the right thing, even when it's inconvenient. Then, why won't you salute me? The general asked quietly. If you want to change the system, wouldn't it be better to work within it? Sarah looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 20 years. Because saluting you would mean accepting what you did as normal, as acceptable. It would mean agreeing that institutional loyalty is more important than moral courage. And I can't do that, sir. My father's death means something, and what it means is that we have to be better. General Thorne stood up slowly, walking back to the window. Outside, the academy grounds looked the same as they had an hour ago, but everything felt different now. The neat formations of cadets, the polished buildings, the flags flying proudly in the morning breeze, all of it seemed somehow less solid, less certain than it had before. He thought about his career, about the decisions he had made over 4 decades in uniform. How many other Sergeant Martinez's had there been? How many other good soldiers had come to him with difficult truths, only to be told that timing wasn't right, that there were bigger pictures to consider, that real leadership sometimes meant making hard choices. What do you want from me, cadet? He asked without turning around. I want you to remember him, Sarah said simply. I want you to remember that your decisions have consequences beyond military efficiency and career advancement. I want you to think about my father the next time someone comes to you with evidence of wrongdoing. And then, I want you to be brave enough to do what he would have expected you to do. The general turned back to face her, seeing not just a cadet now, but the daughter of a man he had failed, a young woman who had somehow found the courage that her father's commander had lacked. What happens now, he asked. Sarah stood and straightened her uniform. Now I go back to my studies. I learn everything I can about leadership and military law and moral philosophy. I graduate, hopefully, and become an officer. And someday, when someone comes to me with a difficult truth, I try to be better than the leaders who failed my father. And what about me? Sarah looked at him steadily, and for a moment the general saw not accusation in her eyes, but something that might have been hope. That's up to you, sir. You can go back to your inspection and your meetings and forget this conversation ever happened. Or you can decide that 40 years of service isn't too late to start getting things right. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. There's one more thing, sir. The unit that was operating in Al-Rashid village. Some of those soldiers are still serving. Some of them are in positions of authority now, training the next generation of soldiers. If you really want to honor my father's memory, you might want to think about that. With that, she opened the door and walked out, leaving General Marcus Thorne alone with his thoughts, his memories, and the weight of decisions that could never be unmade. Outside his window, the academy continued its daily routine. But inside the conference room, a man who had spent his entire adult life believing he understood honor and duty sat quietly and wondered if he had understood anything at all. General Marcus Thorne didn't return to his office that afternoon. Instead, he sat in his staff car in the academy parking lot for nearly 2 hours, staring at the building where hundreds of future officers were learning about leadership, honor, and duty. His driver, Sergeant First Class Williams, had asked twice if everything was all right, but the general had simply nodded and continued his silent vigil. The conversation with Sarah Martinez had shattered something inside him that he hadn't even realized was fragile. For 40 years, he had operated under a clear set of principles. Follow orders, complete the mission, take care of your people. In that order. It was a framework that had guided him through multiple deployments, difficult decisions, and career challenges. It had never occurred to him to question whether that framework itself might be flawed. Finally, as the sun began to set, he instructed Williams to drive him home. But instead of his usual suburban house with its perfectly manicured lawn and military precision landscaping, he found himself asking to be taken to the downtown library. "The library, sir?" Williams asked, confused. "Yes, Sergeant. The main branch. And I'll need you to wait. This might take a while." The library was nearly empty on a Tuesday evening. Just a few college students hunched over laptops and an elderly man reading newspapers in the periodical section. General Thorne approached the reference desk, feeling oddly out of place in his dress uniform among the casual clothes and quiet conversations. "I need to research military records from Afghanistan," he told the young librarian. "Specifically, incidents and investigations from 2018 and 2019. The librarian, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, nodded professionally. "Are you looking for official Department of Defense reports, or news coverage, or academic analyses?" "All of it," the general said. "Everything you can find about civilian casualties, investigation outcomes, unit rotations, anything related to military operations in the Kandahar province during that time frame." For the next 4 hours, General Thorne sat at a computer terminal and dove into a world he had somehow managed to avoid confronting directly. News reports about civilian casualties, human rights organizations documenting abuses, congressional testimony about military oversight, academic papers analyzing the effectiveness of hearts and minds operations. What he found made his stomach turn. The unit that Sergeant Martinez had reported, the one General Thorne had promised to investigate quietly, had indeed been the subject of multiple complaints. Not just from Martinez, but from Afghan local leaders, other military units, and even embedded journalists. The pattern of abuse wasn't an isolated incident, but a systematic problem that had persisted for months. More damning was what he discovered about the aftermath. After Martinez's death, Corporal Peterson had indeed filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General. That investigation had uncovered evidence of at least 8 civilian deaths that could have been prevented, dozens of illegal detentions, and widespread intimidation tactics that had destabilized the entire region. 3 officers had received letters of reprimand. 2 NCOs had been transferred to stateside assignments. No criminal charges were filed because, according to the official report, evidence was degraded by the passage of time and the unit's rotation to new assignments. But it was the final paragraph of the IG report that hit him like a physical blow. This investigation was initiated following the suicide death of SSG David Martinez, who had attempted to report these concerns through proper channels in October 2018. The delay in addressing SSG Martinez's allegations contributed to additional civilian casualties and represents a systemic failure in the command structure's responsiveness to credible reports of misconduct. General Thorne printed the report and sat staring at it until the library closed at 9 o'clock. As he walked back to his car, he felt like he was carrying the weight of every decision he had ever made, every time he had chosen convenience over courage, every moment he had prioritized institutional stability over individual conscience. The next morning, he canceled all his meetings and drove to Arlington National Cemetery. He had no official business there, no ceremony to attend, no grave to visit. He simply needed to walk among the headstones and try to comprehend the magnitude of what Sarah Martinez had told him. The cemetery was peaceful in the early morning light, with dew still clinging to the grass, and only a few other visitors walking the quiet paths. General Thorne found himself in Section 60, where many of the recent war casualties were buried. Row after row of white headstones, each marking a life cut short, a family devastated, a future unrealized. He thought about Sergeant Martinez and wondered if he was buried here, or perhaps in some other military cemetery, or maybe in a civilian cemetery near his family. The general realized he didn't even know where Martinez was from originally, whether he had been married, whether Sarah had other family to help her through her grief. As he walked, he began reading names and dates on the headstones. So many of them were from Afghanistan and Iraq, young men and women who had died following orders, trusting their leaders, believing in their mission. How many of them had faced moral dilemmas in their service? How many had seen things that troubled them but stayed quiet because they trusted the system to work? General Thorne? He turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching, carrying fresh flowers. She looked familiar, though he couldn't immediately place her. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" "Margaret Hendricks," she said, extending her hand. "My son Tommy served under you in Afghanistan." Staff Sergeant Thomas Hendricks. The name hit him immediately. Hendricks had been killed by an IED while on patrol in early 2019, just a few months after Martinez's suicide. A good soldier, a natural leader, someone who had been expected to make sergeant major someday. "Mrs. Hendricks, I'm so sorry for your loss. Tommy was an exceptional soldier." "Thank you, sir. He spoke very highly of you in his letters home." She gestured toward a headstone a few rows away. "I come here every few weeks, just to, well, you understand." General Thorne nodded, though he was beginning to understand that he didn't really understand anything about the true cost of the decisions he had made. "Mrs. Hendricks, can I ask you something? Did Tommy ever mention any concerns about operations in your correspondence? Anything that troubled him?" She looked at him curiously. As a matter of fact, he did. In his last few letters, he seemed worried about something. He said there were some things happening that didn't sit right with him, but that he was trying to work through proper channels to address them. "Did he ever mention a Sergeant Martinez?" Margaret's face brightened slightly. "Oh yes, David Martinez. Tommy mentioned him several times. Said he was one of the best NCOs he'd ever served with, really looked up to him. Tommy was devastated when he heard about what happened to him." General Thorne felt his throat tighten. "What did Tommy say about it?" "He said that Sergeant Martinez had tried to do the right thing, but that no one listened. Tommy was angry about it. Said it made him question whether speaking up was worth the risk. He was struggling with some things he had witnessed, wondering whether to report them or just keep his head down until his deployment ended." "And what did you tell him?" Margaret smiled sadly. "I told him that his father and I had raised him to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. I told him that being a good soldier meant more than following orders. It meant being a good man in uniform." "What happened?" "He was killed 2 weeks later. But in his last letter, he said he had decided to speak up about what he had seen. He said he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent, especially after what had happened to Sergeant Martinez." General Thorne closed his eyes, feeling the weight of another death on his conscience. How many soldiers had been affected by his failure to act? How many had struggled with moral dilemmas because they had lost faith in their leadership? Mrs. Hendricks, I need to tell you something. I was the one Sergeant Martinez came to with his concerns. I was the one who failed to act on them. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Then, you carry a heavy burden, General. But the question isn't what you did then, it's what you're going to do now. They stood in silence for several minutes, looking out over the rows of white headstones. Finally, Margaret placed a hand on his arm. My son believed in the military, General Thorne. Even after everything he saw, even after losing faith in some of his leaders, he still believed that the institution could be better. He died believing that good people in positions of authority could make a difference. I'm not sure I deserve that faith. Maybe not, she said honestly, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is whether you're willing to earn it. After Margaret left to visit her son's grave, General Thorne continued walking through the cemetery. He thought about his career, about the medals on his chest, about the respect he commanded from junior officers. All of it felt hollow now, built on a foundation of compromise and moral cowardice that he had never fully acknowledged. His phone buzzed with messages from his aide, reminding him of meetings and appointments. Instead of responding, he turned the phone off and kept walking. That evening, he returned to his office for the first time since the confrontation with Sarah Martinez. The building was nearly empty, just a few staff officers working late and security personnel making their rounds. He sat at his desk and pulled out a legal pad, beginning to write by hand, something he hadn't done for official business in years. He started with Sergeant David Martinez, trying to reconstruct everything he could remember about their meeting and its aftermath. He wrote about the evidence presented, the decisions he had made, the reasons he had given himself for those decisions. He wrote about the pressure he had been under from higher command, the competing priorities that had seemed so important at the time. But, as he wrote, he began to see his own rationalizations for what they were. The bigger picture considerations that had seemed so crucial were really just career concerns. The sensitive timing that had required delay was really just institutional convenience. The trust in the system he had asked for was really just a request for silence. He wrote until after midnight, filling page after page with details, names, dates, and decisions. When he finished, he had what amounted to a complete confession, a detailed account of how a good soldier's moral courage had been betrayed by his commanding officer's failure of leadership. The next morning, General Thorne made a phone call that would change the trajectory of his career and possibly his life. Inspector General's office, Colonel Martinez speaking. The irony of the name wasn't lost on him. Colonel, this is General Marcus Thorne. I need to report a military crime. Specifically, my failure to properly investigate allegations of misconduct that resulted in additional civilian casualties and the suicide death of a soldier under my command. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sir, I think you may want to consult with a military attorney before making any formal statements. I've already written my statement, General Thorne said, looking at the stack of pages on his desk. I'll be submitting it formally by the end of the week. But first, I have some other business to take care of. His first stop was the academy. He found Sarah Martinez in the library, studying what appeared to be military law texts. She looked up when he approached, her expression guarded but not hostile. Cadet Martinez, may I sit down? She nodded, closing her textbook and giving him her full attention. I want you to know that I remember everything now, he said quietly. About your father, about the meeting we had, about the investigation I promised and failed to conduct. You were right to refuse to salute me. Sarah's eyes showed surprise, but she remained silent. I also want you to know that I've been doing some research into what happened after your father's death. The Inspector General investigation, the outcomes, the lack of accountability. It's worse than even you described. Sir, I didn't come here for revenge or to destroy your career. I just wanted you to understand. You wanted me to remember him, and I do. But more than that, I want to make sure his death counts for something. General Thorne pulled out a folder and placed it on the table between them. These are the personnel files of every soldier who served in that unit in Al-Rashid village. Some of them are still serving, some in leadership positions. With your permission, I'd like to include their activities in a formal statement I'm preparing for the Inspector General. Sarah stared at the folder for a long moment. What would that mean for you? It would probably mean the end of my career. Court-martial, possible prison time, certainly loss of rank and benefits. But it might also mean that other soldiers don't face the choice your father faced. Sir, I can't make that decision for you. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if you'll help me make sure I get the facts right. Your father documented everything carefully. I want to make sure his voice is heard properly this time. Sarah opened the folder and began reading. As she turned pages, General Thorne could see tears forming in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. There's one more thing you should know, she said finally. My father wasn't the only one who tried to report what was happening. 3 other soldiers attempted to speak up through various channels. All of them were discouraged or told to wait for proper investigations that never materialized. Do you know who they are? 2 of them are dead. Combat deaths officially, but I've read their letters home. They were taking unnecessary risks, volunteers for the most dangerous missions. The 3rd was medically discharged for PTSD, but he might be willing to speak with you. General Thorne felt sick again. How many lives have been affected by his failure to act? How many families have been destroyed because he had chosen institutional loyalty over moral courage? Cadet, I want to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer. Do you think your father would have wanted this? The investigation, the court-martial, the publicity. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, considering the question carefully. My father believed in justice, sir. Not revenge, but justice. He believed that when people do wrong things, there have to be consequences or the system breaks down completely. She looked directly into his eyes. But he also believed in redemption. He believed that people could change, that institutions could be reformed, that even terrible mistakes could be turned into opportunities for something better. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that destroying your career wouldn't bring him back or help the soldiers who are serving now. But using your position and your knowledge to prevent future tragedies, that would honor his memory. General Thorne nodded slowly, understanding what she was suggesting. A different kind of accountability. Yes, sir. The kind that makes things better instead of just making people pay. As they sat in the quiet library, surrounded by books about law and leadership and moral philosophy, General Marcus Thorne began to understand that his conversation with Sarah Martinez wasn't ending something. It was beginning something new, something that would require a different kind of courage than he had ever been asked to demonstrate in combat. It would require the courage to admit he had been wrong, to use his remaining time in uniform to build something better, and to accept that true leadership sometimes meant sacrificing everything you had worked for in service of principles that mattered more than personal success. For the first time in days, he felt like he knew what he needed to do. 3 weeks after his conversation with Sarah Martinez in the library, General Marcus Thorne found himself sitting in a room he had never expected to see from this perspective, across from military investigators, with his own attorney present, answering questions about his conduct as a commanding officer. But this wasn't the formal Inspector General investigation he had initially planned to trigger. Instead, it was something more complex and potentially more meaningful. Working with Sarah and the Academy's military law department, he had developed what they were calling a restorative accountability process, an approach that focused on repairing harm and preventing future incidents rather than simply punishing past mistakes. The process had begun with General Thorne voluntarily submitting a detailed report of his failures regarding Sergeant Martinez's allegations. But instead of simply confessing wrongdoing and accepting punishment, he had proposed using his remaining time in service to identify and address systemic problems that had contributed to the tragedy. General Thorne, said Colonel Rebecca Chun, the lead investigator from the Inspector General's office, this is highly unusual. Typically, when senior officers self-report misconduct, we follow standard investigative and disciplinary procedures. I understand that, Colonel, but I believe that standard procedures would miss the opportunity to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Punishing me won't bring back Sergeant Martinez or help the soldiers who are currently facing similar ethical dilemmas. Colonel Chun looked at the thick folder of documentation in front of her. You're proposing what amounts to a complete review of command climate and reporting procedures across multiple units, spanning several years of operations. The scope is enormous. The problem is enormous, General Thorne replied. Sergeant Martinez wasn't an isolated case. In the past 3 weeks, I've identified at least 12 other instances where soldiers attempted to report misconduct through proper channels and were discouraged, delayed, or ignored entirely. Sarah Martinez, who was sitting in on the meeting as a witness and consultant, leaned forward. Sir, may I add something? Colonel Shen nodded. Through my research and conversations with other military families, I've found that many soldiers who attempt to report misconduct face informal retaliation that doesn't show up in official records. Negative performance reviews, assignment to undesirable duties, social isolation from their units. The message gets sent very clearly that whistleblowing is career suicide. That's a serious allegation, Cadet Martinez. Do you have documentation to support it? Sarah placed a folder on the table. These are interviews I've conducted with 37 military family members whose relatives reported ethical concerns over the past 5 years. The patterns are consistent across different units, different theaters of operation, and different types of misconduct. General Thorne watched Colonel Chin flip through Sarah's research, feeling a mixture of pride and shame. Pride that this young cadet had shown more moral courage and investigative skill than most senior officers, and shame that it had taken a cadet to expose problems that should have been obvious to experienced commanders. General, Colonel Chin said, looking up from the documents, assuming we accept your proposal for this alternative accountability process, what specifically are you suggesting? General Thorne had been preparing for this question for weeks. I propose using my remaining 18 months of service to lead a comprehensive review and reform of military ethics reporting procedures. This would involve 3 main components. He pulled out his own prepared presentation. First, a thorough investigation of all cases where soldiers attempted to report misconduct but were discouraged or ignored going back 5 years. Not to punish individual commanders retroactively, but to identify systemic patterns and failures. That's a massive undertaking, Colonel Chin observed. Second, development and implementation of new reporting procedures that protect soldiers who come forward with ethical concerns. This would include independent oversight, mandatory response timelines, and real protection against retaliation. And third, training. Comprehensive ethics training for all officers, focused not on legal compliance, but on moral courage. Teaching commanders how to respond appropriately when subordinates bring forward difficult information. Colonel Chan was taking notes as he spoke. This sounds more like a congressional commission than a military investigation. Maybe that's what we need, General Thorne said quietly. Maybe the military needs to admit that we have a systemic problem and take systemic action to fix it. The meeting continued for another 2 hours with detailed discussions of timelines, resources, oversight mechanisms, and measurable outcomes. By the end, they had outlined a pilot program that would begin with General Thorne's own command and potentially expand to other units if initial results were promising. As they prepared to leave, Colonel Chun asked to speak with General Thorne privately. Sir, I have to ask, what changed? According to your record, you've been a successful commanding officer for decades. Why are you willing to essentially destroy your own career now? General Thorne thought about how to answer that question honestly. Because I met a young woman who had more moral courage at 20 than I've shown in 40 years of service. And because I realized that success built on moral cowardice isn't really success at all. That evening, General Thorne drove to a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town. He had spent considerable effort tracking down former Corporal James Peterson, the soldier who had been medically discharged after attempting to support Sergeant Martinez's allegations. Peterson answered the door cautiously, clearly recognizing the general's face, but uncertain why he would be receiving an unannounced visit. "Corporal Peterson, I'm General Marcus Thorne. I was Sergeant Martinez's commanding officer in Afghanistan. I wonder if I could speak with you." Peterson's expression hardened immediately. "I don't have anything to say to you, sir. I understand your reluctance, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to explain why I'm here." After a long moment, Peterson stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small, but neat, with military precision still evident in how everything was arranged. Photos of Peterson's unit in Afghanistan hung on one wall, and General Thorne could see Sergeant Martinez in several of them, smiling and relaxed in the way soldiers rarely are when senior officers are around. "Corporal, I came here to apologize," General Thorne said without preamble, "and to ask for your help." Peterson sat down across from him, his posture rigid. "Apologize for what, exactly?" "For failing to act on the evidence that you and Sergeant Martinez presented to me. For allowing additional people to be harmed because I was more concerned about institutional stability than moral responsibility. For contributing to David Martinez's death and your medical discharge." Peterson stared at him in silence for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "Do you have any idea what it's been like, sir? Living with the knowledge that people died because we were told to trust the system? Watching the news reports about continued problems in Afghanistan, and knowing that some of them could have been prevented if you had just done your job?" "No, I don't. But I'm trying to understand now. I wake up every night thinking about those families in Al-Rashid village, about the old man who died in custody, about the children who were traumatized by those raids. And I think about Sergeant Martinez, who died believing he was a failure when the real failure was you." General Thorne absorbed the verbal assault without defending himself. Everything Peterson was saying was true, and he deserved to hear it. "You're right, Corporal. The failure was mine. But I'm hoping that acknowledgement isn't the end of the story." "What do you mean?" General Thorne explained the restorative accountability process, the investigation into systemic problems, the proposed reforms to reporting procedures. As he spoke, he watched Peterson's expression change from anger to skepticism to something that might have been cautious hope. "You're really going to risk your career to fix this?" "I'm going to end my career trying to fix this. There's a difference." Peterson stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where children were playing despite the late hour. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to help me understand what went wrong from the perspective of the soldiers who tried to do the right thing. I want your input on what reforms might actually work. And I want your permission to include your experience in the formal review." "What would that mean for me?" "It would mean telling your story officially on the record. It might mean testifying before investigative panels or congressional committees. It wouldn't be easy, but it could help prevent other soldiers from going through what you and Sergeant Martinez went through." Peterson was quiet for a long time, wrestling with emotions and memories that General Thorne could only imagine. "I've been seeing a therapist," Peterson said finally. "Working through the PTSD, trying to figure out how to live with what I saw and what I failed to prevent. She says that trauma can either destroy you or transform you into someone who helps prevent others from experiencing the same trauma." "What do you think?" "I think David Martinez deserves better than to be forgotten. I think the families in Al-Rashid village deserve justice, even if it's too late to help them directly. And I think maybe this is the only way any of us are going to be able to live with what happened." Peterson turned back to face him. "I'll help you, General, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, this can't be some public relations exercise designed to make the military look good. If we're going to do this, we tell the whole truth, even when it's ugly." "Agreed." "Second, any reforms that come out of this process have to be real and enforceable, not just policy papers that commanders can ignore when convenient." "Agreed." "Third, I want to be involved in designing the training for officers. Not just consulted, but actively involved. The people who are going to receive moral courage training should hear from someone who knows what it costs when leaders don't have it." General Thorne nodded. "That's exactly what we need. They spent the next 3 hours going through Peterson's memories of the incident, his attempts to support Martinez's allegations, and his observations about what had gone wrong in the command structure. By the time General Thorne left, they had outlined a comprehensive critique of military reporting procedures and begun sketching ideas for reform. Driving home that night, General Thorne reflected on how much his life had changed in less than a month. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a successful general preparing for a routine inspection, confident in his leadership and his legacy. Now he was essentially committing professional suicide in service of principles he should have upheld decades earlier. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was actually serving his country rather than just serving his career. The next morning brought a call that would test his commitment to this new path. General Thorne? This is General Patricia Morrison, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. I understand you've initiated some kind of unusual investigation into your own conduct. General Thorne had been expecting this call. Word travels fast in military circles, especially when a senior officer does something unprecedented. Yes, ma'am. I've identified serious failures in my handling of misconduct allegations that resulted in preventable harm. General, I'm going to be direct with you. This kind of public self-flagellation doesn't help anyone. It undermines confidence in military leadership and provides ammunition for critics of the institution. I strongly recommend you reconsider this course of action. Ma'am, with respect, I believe that restoring confidence in military leadership requires demonstrating that we can police ourselves effectively and learn from our mistakes. What you're proposing sounds like a massive fishing expedition that could damage careers and operations across multiple commands. Have you considered the broader implications? General Thorne looked out his office window at the flag flying over the academy grounds. Ma'am, I've spent 40 years considering the broader implications of protecting the institution. I think it's time I considered the implications of protecting the principles the institution is supposed to serve. There was a long pause on the line. General Thorne, I'm going to give you some free advice. You have 18 months until retirement. You could finish your career quietly, with your reputation and benefits intact. What you're proposing will likely result in early retirement, loss of benefits, and possibly criminal charges. Is whatever point you're trying to make worth that? General Morrison, 3 weeks ago, I met a young cadet who refused to salute me because I failed her father so completely that he took his own life rather than continue living with the compromise I forced him to make. If I spend the next 18 months proving that his death mattered, that will be the most worthwhile thing I've done in my entire career. Another pause. I see. Well, General, if you're determined to proceed with this investigation, you'll be doing it without official support or protection. And if it goes badly, don't expect the institution to shield you from the consequences. I understand, ma'am, but I hope the institution will learn from whatever we discover. After the call ended, General Thorne sat quietly in his office, understanding fully for the first time what Sergeant Martinez must have felt when he walked into this same building with evidence of misconduct and a faith that the system would work. The difference was that General Thorne no longer had faith in the system. Instead, he had something he thought might be more valuable, a commitment to making the system worthy of faith. His intercom buzzed. Sir, Cadet Martinez is here to see you. Send her in. Sarah entered his office and stood at attention, though he noticed she still didn't salute. At ease, Cadet. What can I do for you? Sir, I heard about your conversation with General Morrison. Word gets around. I imagine it does. I wanted you to know that what you're doing, my father would have respected it. It won't bring him back, but it might prevent other families from going through what we went through. That's the goal, Cadet. Sarah hesitated, then said, Sir, there's something else. I've been thinking about what this process means for you personally, for your family, for your legacy. Are you sure you're prepared for what's coming? General Thorne smiled sadly. Cadet, for the past 3 weeks, I've been learning that the legacy I thought I was building was hollow. If I could spend my last months in uniform building something real instead, that seems like a fair trade, even if it means losing everything you've worked for, especially if it means that. Because maybe that's what real leadership looks like, being willing to lose everything for the sake of doing what's right. Sarah finally smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since their first confrontation in the courtyard. "In that case, sir, I have a request." "What's that, cadet?" "When this is all over, when you've finished the investigation and implemented the reforms and told my father's story properly, when you've done everything you can make sure no other soldier faces the choice he faced, I'd like to salute you then." General Marcus Thorne felt tears forming in his eyes as he understood what she was offering. Not just forgiveness, but the possibility of redemption. The chance to earn something he had never deserved, but might someday be worthy of. The respect of a daughter whose father he had failed, and, through her, perhaps his own self-respect. "I would be honored, Cadet Martinez. I would be deeply honored." As she left his office, General Thorne began preparing for what he knew would be the most important and most difficult mission of his military career. The mission to transform his greatest failure into something that might prevent future failures. His deepest shame into something that might restore honor to the principles he had sworn to serve. 18 months later, the military academy's graduation ceremony proceeded with its usual pomp and precision. Hundreds of new second lieutenants stood in perfect formation, their families filling the stadium seats, cameras capturing moments that would be treasured for generations. The morning sun cast everything in golden light, and the atmosphere was one of celebration and hope. But in a small conference room adjacent to the main ceremony, a different kind of recognition was taking place. General Marcus Thorne, though he would be retiring as Colonel Thorne, having accepted a reduction in rank as part of his accountability process, stood before a small gathering that included Sarah Martinez, now graduating at the top of her class, former Corporal James Peterson, and Margaret Hendricks, the mother of Staff Sergeant Thomas Hendricks. Also present were Colonel Rebecca Chun from the Inspector General's office, the Academy's commandant, and 3 members of Congress who had overseen the implementation of what was now being called the Martinez Protocol, a comprehensive set of reforms to military ethics reporting procedures. The past year and a half had been the most challenging and most meaningful period of Marcus Thorne's career. The investigation he had initiated had grown far beyond his original scope, ultimately documenting over 60 cases of failed ethics reporting across multiple commands and resulting in significant changes to military policy and training. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Colonel Chun, who had become not just an investigator, but an advocate for the reform process, "we're here today to mark the completion of the most comprehensive review of military ethics procedures in over 3 decades. The numbers were staggering. The investigation had identified systemic failures that had affected hundreds of soldiers over multiple years. More importantly, it had resulted in concrete changes, new independent oversight mechanisms, mandatory response timelines for ethics reports, real protection against retaliation, and comprehensive training programs for officers at all levels. The Martinez Protocol has now been implemented across all branches of the military," Colonel Chun continued. "Early results suggest that reports of misconduct have increased by over 200%, which we interpret as a positive sign that soldiers now feel safer coming forward with concerns. But the most significant change wasn't captured in statistics. It was visible in the faces of the young officers about to begin their careers, who had been trained in a new understanding of moral courage and leadership responsibility. "Colonel Thorne," said Congressman Michael Torres, who had championed the reforms in the House Armed Services Committee, "would you like to say a few words about what this process has meant?" Marcus stood slowly, feeling every one of his 64 years. The past 18 months had aged him considerably, but they had also given him something he hadn't possessed in decades: peace with his own reflection. "When this began, I thought I was confessing to a single failure of leadership," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I thought I was accepting punishment for one decision that had terrible consequences." He looked at Sarah, who was listening intently despite having heard variations of this speech many times during the long investigation process. "What I learned is that my failure wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a military culture that prioritized institutional loyalty over moral courage, that taught officers to avoid difficult truths rather than confront them. He turned to Peterson, who had become not just a witness, but a key architect of the new training programs. James Peterson taught me that the soldiers who try to do the right thing aren't problems to be managed. They're exactly the people we need to listen to most carefully. Peterson nodded, his own journey from damaged veteran to reform advocate having been remarkable to witness. Margaret Hendricks taught me that every decision I made affected real families, real people, not just abstract concepts of mission effectiveness and career advancement. Margaret wiped her eyes, but her expression was one of satisfaction rather than sadness. Her son's death had contributed to reforms that might prevent future tragedies. And Sarah Martinez taught me that true leadership sometimes requires destroying everything you've built in order to build something better. The room fell silent as Marcus gathered his thoughts for what he knew would be his final official statement as a military officer. Sergeant David Martinez died because he believed in a system that failed him. He died believing he was a failure when the real failure was mine. I can't bring him back, and I can't undo the harm that resulted from my moral cowardice. But I can make sure that his death contributed to something better. He pulled out a folder containing the final implementation report of the Martinez Protocol. These reforms aren't perfect. They won't solve every problem or prevent every tragedy. But they represent something important, an acknowledgement that moral courage is not optional for military leaders, that protecting soldiers who speak up is not just policy, but sacred duty. Sarah stood up from her seat, her dress blue uniform impeccable, her bearing that of an officer ready to serve. "Sir, may I respond?" Marcus nodded, curious what she wanted to say. 18 months ago, I refused to salute you because I believe you represented everything that was wrong with military leadership. Today, I want to say something different. She moved to stand directly in front of him, her posture formal, but her eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like respect. What you've done over the past year and a half, accepting accountability, sacrificing your career, working to prevent future tragedies, that's what real leadership looks like. That's what my father would have wanted from his commanders. Sarah raised her hand in a crisp salute. "Sir, it would be my honor to salute you now." Marcus felt tears flowing freely as he returned the salute. In that moment, 18 months of investigation, congressional hearings, public criticism, and personal costs suddenly felt worthwhile. But Sarah wasn't finished. "There's one more thing, sir. The graduating class has asked me to present you with this." She handed him a framed document that took him a moment to process. It was a commission as an honorary instructor at the military academy, signed by every member of the graduating class. "We want you to stay involved in training future officers," Sarah explained. "Not as a general or a colonel, but as someone who understands the real cost of moral failures and the real value of moral courage." Marcus looked around the room at the faces of people who had become not just colleagues, but friends through this difficult process. Peterson, who would be joining the academy staff as a civilian instructor in ethics. Margaret Hendricks, who had become an advocate for military families affected by moral injuries. Colonel Chun, who had transformed from skeptical investigator to committed reformer. "I accept," he said simply, "but only if we name the Ethics Center after your father." "The Sergeant David Martinez Center for Military Ethics," Sarah said, smiling. "I think you would have liked that." The official ceremony concluded with presentations of the final reform documents and recognition of all the participants in the process. But as the room began to empty, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah for the first time since their initial confrontation in the academy courtyard. "Cadet, I'm sorry, Lieutenant Martinez now," he said, noting her new rank insignia. "I want to ask you something I've been wondering about for months." "What's that, sir?" "Do you think your father would have approved of what we've done? Not just the reforms, but the way we did it? The publicity, the congressional hearings, the damage to military reputation?" Sarah considered the question carefully, as she always did. I think my father would have said that the military's reputation should be based on how well it lives up to its own values, not on how well it hides its failures. She looked out the window at the graduation ceremony proceeding on the academy grounds. He believed that institutions are only as good as the people in them, and that good people have a responsibility to make their institutions better, even when it's costly, especially when it's costly, because that's how you know it matters. Marcus nodded, understanding finally why this young woman had been able to accomplish what decades of military experience had not. She had never lost sight of the principles that were supposed to guide everything else. What's next for you, Lieutenant? I've been assigned to a unit that's deploying to Afghanistan next year. I'll be working on civil affairs operations, trying to rebuild relationships with local communities. And you're not worried about serving in the same theater where your father died? Sarah smiled. Sir, my father died trying to protect innocent people from soldiers who had lost sight of their moral responsibilities. If I can serve in a unit that remembers those responsibilities, then I'm helping fulfill his mission. You'll be an outstanding officer, Lieutenant Martinez. I hope so, sir. But if I ever find myself in a situation where I have to choose between my career and my conscience, I know which choice to make. As they walked out of the conference room together, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. 18 months ago, he had been a successful general whose greatest concern was completing a routine inspection. Today, he was a retired colonel whose greatest accomplishment was learning how to accept accountability for his failures. The graduation ceremony was reaching its climax as hundreds of new officers tossed their caps into the air. Among them was Sarah Martinez, who would carry her father's memory and her hard-won wisdom into a military that was slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely becoming more worthy of the sacrifices made in its name. Marcus Thorne watched the celebration from the academy steps, no longer a general, but finally, perhaps a leader worthy of the title. The young officers streaming past him represented something he had helped create, a generation trained not just in tactics and strategy, but in the moral courage necessary to use them properly. As the crowd dispersed and families took pictures with their newly commissioned officers, Marcus noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Captain Rodriguez, his former aide, now wearing the oak leaves of a major. Sir, Colonel Thorne, I wanted to thank you. For what, Rodriguez? For showing us what real leadership looks like. What you did, it changed how I think about command, about responsibility, about what we owe the soldiers under our command. Marcus smiled. You would have figured it out eventually. You're a good officer. Maybe. But I might have figured it out too late after I'd made the same mistakes you made. Now I won't. As Rodriguez walked away, Marcus understood that this was perhaps the greatest gift of the entire process. Not just the policies that had been changed or the systems that had been reformed, but the minds that had been open to new ways of thinking about leadership and moral responsibility. The sun was setting over the academy grounds.